Good to go.
Okay.
And there's also a podium. Yeah. So if they're gonna stay at the podium, they don't need to use.
Oh, so this is on too. Yeah. Okay. Is it a problem if this is up here with it, or?
I don't think so.
Okay.
It starts to feedback.
All right. All right, I'm going to call this meeting to order. Thank you. It's a blitz. It's got to go fast. We got to get it started on time, end on time, everything. Welcome to the maybe like 4th annual faculty research blitz for the Department of Philosophy and Religion. I'm Don Fallis. I'll be your host for the evening. Let's see, announcements. Our esteemed chair of department, Serena Perek, is unfortunately away at an international conference, so she sends her apologies. The goal of today is to give everybody faculty, staff, students, a quick snapshot of some of the research that's going on in the department. We've got slides all organized. In between each presentation, you'll get to see the list of who's coming up, so you'll know where we're at all times. At the end of the blitz, everybody's going to get all the faculty that are on the list are going to get 5 minutes. If you go over, I will cut you off and take you away. So try to go quick. And at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. So save your questions. If there's research that you're interested in, either ask in the Q&A session or go up and talk to the appropriate faculty member. Just so that this will go as quickly as possible, my standard procedure is to put myself at the top of the list so I can get my spiel out of the way and get out of the way. So first order of business, Professor Don Fallis. My research tends to focus on lying and deception. And in particular, as an epistemologist, I'm interested in how deception works and the various different forms it can take. There's cool stuff like mimicking, masking, repackaging, and dazzling. I'm actually going to be teaching in the spring a course on the philosophy and ethics of lying and deception, which will cover this and a bunch of other stuff, because basically it's going to be a survey of the philosophy of lying and deception using all sorts of different areas of philosophy as a lens to look at it. So we'll talk about the metaphysics, the ethics, the epistemology, game theory, all sorts of stuff. Now, that's what I usually would talk to you about today as my current research. But because the conference that the Ethics Institute organizes that's called the ethics, the Information Ethics Roundtable, which is going to be held in the spring, because the topic of that conference is the epistemology and ethics of virtual reality, I've sort of like focused my interest this year on that particular topic. And in particular, I'm looking at the simulation hypothesis, the idea that all of well, it seems like we're living in a physical world. Actually, all of this is part of a computer simulation. And I don't really take a position on whether that's likely to be the case, but David Chalmers has suggested that if that's the case, most of the stuff we believe is true. There actually are chairs. They're virtual chairs, but they're chairs. We have hands. I think he's a little too optimistic, as you might expect from a expert on deception. I think that if we're living in a simulation, we're massively deceived. So if you're interested in that, come to the conference and I'll tell you about that. The other thing that I'm working on harkens back to my dissertation from 20 or so years ago. I did work on the epistemology of mathematics. So basically, how does evidence work in mathematics? Now, just to give you just a quick idea of what I was worried about is this is a graph showing the size of the largest prime number that mathematicians have discovered at various points in history. I guess you can't see the chronology across the bottom, but it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, faster and faster. And from this graph, you might very well expect that if we keep going, mathematicians will continue to find more prime numbers. We've got some reason to believe that the search for larger and larger primes will never end. But as a matter of fact, we don't have to rely on this inductive evidence that it looks like it's this ever increasing trend. 300 BC, Euclid proved that there are infinitely many primes. The list is going to go on and on and on. But sometimes in mathematics, we haven't yet found a deductive proof to establish a particular sort of claim. But nevertheless, we have good probabilistic evidence that the claim is true. And I and subsequently several other philosophers have argued that actually probabilistic evidence can, under certain circumstances, be just as good as deductive proofs in mathematics. Now, I got invited to give a talk at a math conference in January, and as you might expect, mathematicians hate this talk. This is like sacrilegious as far as the mathematicians are concerned. But we have a colloquium series here at the philosophy department, and I'm going to practice out this talk on what I hope is a more friendly audience on December 7th. So if you want to hear more about that, come to that event. That's me. Next on the agenda, Professor Fadike Castor. That mic, and you just
hit enter.
No, just
advance. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, I'm Dr. Fadike Castor, and I am on the religious studies side of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. I research race, religion, and politics, specifically in the African diaspora and the Caribbean, but ranging a wide view of diaspora, ranging from West Africa to the US. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and one of my primary methods is ethnography. So I do both in-person and what we call digital ethnography or research online. Interviews, media collection, archival stuff. And I teach classes on religion, popular culture, social justice, and Africana studies. So my current research project is called Black Spirits Matter, Locating Spaces of Spiritual Marinage. And I have various research sites. One of them is a community of Maroon activists who are making a claim for African-descended Maroon communities in the Americas to get rights of indigeneity. All right, so I'm looking at that and what it means to create collective communities geared towards freedom, right? And what informs that. One of the other research sites that I'm going to talk about, I'm writing a book called Black Spirits Matter, and is Ifa Arisha Digital Counterpublics. I've recently published an article in the Black Scholar. Shoot me an email if you want a copy, that talks about how people are coming together online to organize for social justice. And they're coming together across divisions within African diasporic religious communities, all right? And they're coming together in the wake of police violence against African descended peoples, right? Which you have known through your life. And that has a history that goes back to the beginning of America, but its recent contemporary history has galvanized people to organize in new ways using technologies that are newly available to them. And I call these digital counterpublics. I'm extending an argument by a theorist named Mark Lamont Hill. I'm teaching this spring a seminar on race, religion, and power. And in this seminar, we're going to talk about Rastafari and resistance. We're going to talk about civil rights and Black power and its relationship to different forms of Black religion, including African Islam and African-American Islam. And we're going to talk about the movement for Black lives and how it intersects with religion, specifically African diasporic religions. So that's going to be a Wednesday, Friday, 11:45 a.m. class. Philosophy 4903. So please come and take the seminar. It's going to be good. We're going to have some great discussions there. And this is my email. Take this down because I won't be here at the end because I'm actually currently in Seattle because life is a hologram and I'm bilocated and I'm at the American Anthropological Association meetings in Seattle right now. And my panel is coming up in a little bit. So I'll be running so that I can unify my different holographic representations into something solid enough to give a presentation. So, but I look forward to talking with you, and I'll pass this on to the next person, Professor Morales.
Hello, thanks for being here. My name is Jorge Morales, and I'm a new faculty in the department. And I'm, as you can tell from, well, I guess it's hard to see, but from the slide, I study, broadly speaking, three things: perception, consciousness, and introspection. So I study what we see, how what we see becomes conscious, and how that things that we see consciously can be introspected when we reflect about our own minds. And I do it using different methods. So my background is in philosophy. That's how I started my academic career. And I use philosophy to study these questions that I will tell you a little bit more about in a second. But I'm also a psychologist and a neuroscientist. I'm in fact jointly appointed in the Department of Psychology. And sometimes some of these questions I asked by thinking about them using philosophy. And sometimes I ask these questions by running empirical programs, like asking empirical questions. So in terms of perception, or like really the question that I'm really curious about, it's how we see things that aren't there. So when we see the world, and maybe this connects to virtual reality, but the way I ask the question is a little bit different. Like I want to understand what's the components that the subject puts into our visual experiences. So there might be a chair over there, but the fact that I'm seeing it from this perspective means that actually the way I see it matters, right? Like if I step over here, that same chair remains the same. My mind can actually extract the fact that that's the same chair. The chair didn't move, I moved, but the way it's were given to me changes, right? I'm seeing it from a different perspective. My point of view, my literally position in the world with respect to that object changes. And I really want to understand how that process works, to what extent our minds like incorporate those subjective and objective properties of the world when we, for example, recognize an object. Another example is the perception of absences. Absences literally are things that aren't there. They don't exist. They are in front of us, but sometimes we can perceive them. For example, these chairs over there are empty. And to some extent, like they don't look like something is missing necessarily. Like it's obvious to me visually that, you know, they're not occupied. But if my buddy Austin had been sitting over there and then they stood up and left, their absence will be more salient to me. And part of what I study is that a visual phenomenon? Like, of course, I know that Austin left, and I know that they are not over there. I can think about that, but I think that we can also see that something is missing, and I study to what extent that looks like, you know, the processes of seeing that something is absent are similar or different to literally seeing an object being in front of me. That's perception. And consciousness and introspection are questions that run in tandem. Largely, the bigger question that I'm curious about, it's like to what extent the vividness or the degree of awareness that one has about whatever, like how vividly you see a chair or how vividly you can imagine something affects not only like the whole structure of your conscious awareness. Like, for example, if you're in a very intense pain, it seems like you kind of become blind to other things, right? Like if you've experienced really intense pain, you're not hearing well, you're not seeing well, you're not like paying attention to things. And that, I think it's because intense experiences shape how our conscious field, as it were, is not only shaped, but also like what kind of things can be in there, or with what amount of prominence. And that's a question that I ask as a philosopher, but I also ask as a psychologist, as a neuroscientist. So we're trying to find out which brain regions are more likely to code, not just for being aware, but for being more or less aware of something, mostly in the visual domain. And introspection is almost like the flip side of this question, which is how do we know about these things, right? Like it's very easy to see whether someone processed something perceptually, because I don't know, you ask them, did you see that thing? And then if they answer correctly, you're like, okay, I guess they saw it correctly. Or the same with other sensory modalities, but asking someone, were you aware of these things? It's really tricky because they can say yes. And they can, even if you ask them questions about it, they might be answering correctly based on visual processing, but not because they were aware of the things. Or maybe you ask someone, did you see something? And they might say no, and yet that might just be a way of responding to how they experience the world. So I'm trying in my work to understand how we know our minds better. And just to wrap up, some of the classes that I'll be teaching next semester are in philosophy, scientific approaches to philosophy, like how science and philosophy intersect and interact. And the other class that I'm teaching in psychology, it's a seminar in sensation and perception, where we mostly read papers on consciousness. So if you're interested in an empirical bend on the question, like check that class out. And thank you. And pass it on to Professor Matt.
All right. So you said just use the arrows, Don? Yeah. All right. Let me take this on. Hi, I'm Professor Kay Matizan. I do philosophy. And I thought I would just try to do a little philosophy right now. So this is a paper that I'm working on with Professor Fallis called Epistemic Fakes. And in this paper, I've written 3 papers on fake news. One of those was with Don. And in this paper, we're sort of extending our analysis of online fakes and also developing our account of fakes by responding to some criticisms we've gotten from other people on our analyses of fake news. So we want to talk about epistemic fakes. We can define a fake as something that's not a genuine X, whatever the genuine thing is. It's designed to resemble a genuine X, and or it's represented as being a genuine X by someone who knows that it's not. And we're actually still tweaking this definition, but that's what we have so right now. Epistemic fakes are made to look like genuine epistemic resources that we can rely on. And I'm particularly interested in the ones that we rely on online. So there's fake news, which is designed to look like genuine news, deep fakes designed to look like genuine videos, bots designed to appear to be genuine people online, and sock puppets designed to look like genuine testifiers, people actually expressing their own views rather than the views of the government, for instance. And we argue that the result of such epistemic fakes is that they result in epistemic and ethical harm because they, one, lead people to have false beliefs because they believe the fakes, but they also undermine our trust in these valuable epistemic resources. So now if we don't know whether this article is a real news article or a fake news article, then we're less likely to trust the news. That makes it harder for us to gain knowledge. So as I said, we've gotten some objections to our analysis. And here I have some of the objections, and I'm just going to quickly go through and say how we're responding and how that develops our account of online fakes. So these are all to our account of fake news, but we're going to expand that and talk about fakes more generally. So one is a claim that fake is not necessarily a privative adjective. And if you didn't know what privative adjective means, it's basically an adjective which says that the thing it's modifying is not what it is, right? So a privative adjective, when you say a fake gun, is not really a gun. Just like we're saying, fake news isn't really news. But there are times we use fake where it's not privative, like a fake story is a story. A fake website is a website. However, we think that the way we're using fake, it is privative. We are talking about cases where the thing in question isn't what it's pretending to be. Fake news is not news. We're defining news as something that's produced via journalistic processes like are taught in journalism schools and are promulgated by professional journalistic associations. And the reason we want to say that it's not what it appears to be is because that's precisely what the person creating the fake is trying to make you think. It's trying to make you think that it's real news or trying to make you think it's a real video when it is not. All right. Second, there's no agreement on what is genuine. You have to have an agreement on what the genuine thing is to have an idea of a fake. And so we say genuine news is information produced by journalistic processes, but it's been argued that, well, but do we really have like a clear notion of news? But we say, well, it's got to be clear enough that someone can fake it, right? There's got to be some identifiable thing that actually we tend to rely on such that it's worthwhile to someone to fake it, to fool us into relying on the information. So we have a good enough idea of what counts as genuine news such that we can say, but there's also fake news. Also, where am I? Okay, I'm going to skip the other ones because I'm running out of time. But you can see how the argument is going. So finally, I wanted to talk about why do we care? Why should we care about online fakes? And in my analysis of this, I'm using a theory I've been developing called informational justice that thinks about what people have a right to as seekers of information, sources of information, and subjects of information. So epistemic fakes harm us as seekers of information because we're going to be misled get false information. Also, it's going to be harder for us to find accurate information. If we don't know whether this is a person or a sock puppet, a deep fake video or real video, it's going to be harder for us to find reliable information. As sources of information, it's going to make it less likely that we're going to be believed. Is that a real person posting that, or is that a bot? Is that a real person, or are they really genuine, or is it a sock puppet? Secondly, because there's such a plethora of fakes, our voices are more likely to get drowned out online because, like, say there's a whole bunch of bots out there producing fake testimony. And finally, as subjects of information, where there's stuff about us, people can be convincingly depicted in fakes in ways that are demeaning and in ways that are incorrect. And that can actually lead to them not being trusted as sources of information. So if I'm depicted as someone who is very ignorant, there's a deep fake video of me saying all sorts of false things, then you might no longer trust what I say. So as subjects of information, it can harm us. And furthermore, there's evidence that data is being collected on us in order to determine what kind of fakes we're most vulnerable to. So there's another way, and us as subjects, our privacy is getting invaded so that we can be targeted with fakes designed to fool us in particular. So I teach technology and human values, and I teach information ethics. And in both those courses, we talk about these kind of things, plus a lot of other kind of issues. So if you find any of this interesting, I would love to see you in one of those classes. So thanks so much.
Hello, am I up?
See. My mouse. Maybe see the mouse. I never broke it. Yeah, sorry. I need Claire's help.
Oh no. Yeah. Okay. I think the mouse is dead. Yeah.
Okay,
Oh, there we go. There we go. Oh, false alarm. Oh.
All right.
Awesome.
Now you're up.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jay Gupta. I'm a professor of philosophy out in Oakland. Zooming in from Oakland at from Mills College at Northeastern. So a new part of the Northeastern family. And yeah, I've got one screen to share, which is basically a question. Let's see. We all see that? Yeah. Yeah, this is a mouthful. So I'm writing a book on Hegel's ethical and political philosophy. And I take this to be one of the central questions I'm trying to answer, write about and answer. So we'll just try to unpack this question. It concerns the relation of two of Hegel's main works, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, which is an earlier work, and the Philosophy of Right, which is a later work. The Philosophy of Right is sometimes described as Hegel's mature ethical and political philosophy. Some have described it as a form of communitarianism, which is, and that's captured in the phrase ethical life. And so one of my questions is, how do we go from the phenomenology of spirit, which I read to be largely a book about alienation. And let me just say that's one reading of the book, but I think it's a good reading. It's a book, it's a reading that in many ways Karl Marx shared. And we know Karl Marx as someone who, for whom alienation is a central category, particularly in alienated labor. It's often overlooked, though, the degree to which alienation is a central category for at least the early Hegel. So this is the basis of the question. If Hegel was writing about modern alienation in his early work, and what did that consist of? Well, he talks about modern individuals as these kind of critically reflective persons, right? Who have the kind of this literally new Neuzeit, modern capacity to situate themselves in relationship to everything that has gone before. All the old traditions, religion, in short, all what we'd call the sources of normativity and ethical meaning. Right, this is a book about sort of a fracture and alienation where these new modern selves kind of appraise the old traditions, the old sources of meaning and value, of ethical normativity, and take reason as a kind of weaponized reason, if you like, and say we no longer see these sources of normativity as normatively binding, right? So there's a kind of a crisis, if you like, in ethics, and there's a phrase Hegel uses of doing consciousness suffering violence at its own hands, right? So this modern subject, takes this kind of weaponized reason, turns it at all the sources of meaning and value where once felt at home in the world, no longer feels that it is at home in the world. In short, alienation. So that's a word. It's about being othered and othering, not feeling at home in the old traditional practices and so forth. Right. So these critical self-conscious selves that use, as I say, a kind of a weaponized reason, traditional sources of normativity. Hence, they feel alienated in the world from those sources, from one another. This is a big feature of Hegel's account, right? That community somehow goes missing, right? We don't feel connected to each other in the same ways we did in more traditional societies. So that's sort of a real thumbnail sketch of what's partly going on in the phenomenology. I think it's an important part of the phenomenology. But by the time we roll around to the mature ethical and political philosophy, we get a picture of what Hegel calls ethical life, which seems to be a story of how human beings are kind of communally integrated with one another, right? And particularly Hegel points to the state, the political, as Aristotle might call it, as a place where we find meaning and value.
30 seconds.
Sorry, as citizens and so forth. So I'll wrap up if I'm running out of time. That's the question. Where did these critical self-conscious selves go, right? Are they part of ethical life or not? If they are part of ethical life, then what happened to that weaponized reason that tears apart any possible source of normativity? I'll stop there.
Okay, so if you could stop sharing, then
yes. let me
You'll take over
figure
the
that
screen.
out.
All
Okay.
right, cool.
Got
Are
it.
you there, Judith?
I am here.
Okay. I think if you
I'm sorry.
you're up, so you can start sharing your screen.
Okay. I have tried to share my screen. We're going to try it again, but I'm not sure it's going to work. 1 second. Are you getting anything? Okay. Shall we just go with
Yeah, you'll just have to talk to us.
I'll just have to talk to you. I can do that. Do you want to put, let's see, will it allow you to put me up? My face?
You're up.
We see you.
You see, okay. Hey, I am Judith Bishop. I am the Associate Professor of Global Religions, Women's and Gender Studies and History at Mills College Northeastern. And it's really good to see this kind of student interest in the Department of Philosophy and Religion. My focuses, my foci as a scholar and as a teacher are on, number one, religion and gender. Gender is, as I'm sure you know, a very fluid and is very fluid and intersects, only exists in intersection with other matrices of identities such as race, class, sexual identity, geographical location, etc. So gender, religion and gender, the way in which religion is gendered, the way in which religion influences gender, the way in which gender influences religion are very interesting concepts and core to both my teaching and my scholarship. I come from the more perspective of anthropology of religion. I am most interested in how religion functions in society than I am perhaps in some of the doctrinal aspects of religion. So that is my basic position from which I work. I also am very fascinated by religion at the borders, how religion constructs and reconstructs meanings in cross-cultural contact situations. One of my most recent scholarly work on this looks particularly at Bethu Brigda. That is one of the oldest texts we have in a European vernacular. It is an old Irish text about the Saint Bridget, which actually has two very important aspects for my work. Number one, it has her ordained as a bishop. Number two, it actually is our oldest European text in both Latin and a vernacular. So it's very productive to apply, I found it very productive to apply code switching, modern code switching theory to these language changes between Old Irish and Latin in this text. It reviews a number of things. It reviews, number one, that this particular, the way gender and gender exceptionality works in these switching of Old Irish to Latin terminologies. The way, for example, at one point, Bridget gets into a verbal duel with the devil. And she starts out in Latin, he code switches to Old Irish. She follows him and code switches back to Old Irish. Then he switches to Latin, she follows him, switches to Latin. She switches back, he follows her. So it's this kind of verbal duel of linguistic prowess and ability to express oneself that is very characteristic of Old Irish heroic literature, but the heroic literature doesn't show up in the women in the saints' lives, particularly the Bethu Brigda. It does show up in that. The ways in which then religion can be one of those influencing factors on gender. That it can both empower women and, of course, as we've also seen, very much disempower women. But how do they use it in those ways is a continuing interest of mine. And of course, the code switching helps me explore that in a variety of ways. So Bethany Brigden, code switching, movement across the diglossic continuum shows, especially in this text, it shows how the heroes of the text are definitely sophisticated users of a diglossic or bilingual continuum. And they actually switch to different concepts and incorporate that entire concept simply by using the language. So these are areas that I am excited about and have been exploring most recently. I'm also working on just an introductory text on religion and gender, and that includes both studies of femininity, studies of masculinity, studies of non-binary. There are many examples in religion of non-binary identities, which have a welcome and authoritative place in society. So I'm working as well on that text. And I teach also in conjunction with that. For example, I teach a class on women in religion, particularly Western religions, that starts off with women in voodoo, goes into women in several Native American religions, and then Islam, Judaism, Christianity, kind of winds up with the Atlantic Circle, and winds up with women in voodoo, in Yoruba traditions, which, as you know, is kind of the grandmother of the voodoo tradition. I also teach a class in sustainability and spirituality that looks at religion and religious perspectives across the world in terms of sustainability. We've got very active movements in all the major world religions that are focused on global climate change and focused on sustainability. And this particular class looks at those and how do those set up the relationships between, for example, human animals, non-human animals, and the earth, and what is the relationship taught in those traditions with regard to the responsibilities of those relationships. Am I out of time?
You're just out of time. So thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you all, working with you all, and glad to be a part of the Northeastern Global Campus.
Thank you so much, Gita. Just gonna share this. All right.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Basil. Why am I here? Oh, right. Research Blitz. So I'm going to talk about just a paper that I recently wrapped up and I'm still polishing with some colleagues, David Gray Grant and Jeff Behrens, who are not at Northeastern. In it, we take up this question of whether what we call the interpretability thesis is true, which says in at least some context, there's something problematic about deploying opaque algorithmic systems for which even the computer scientists that build them cannot understand why the inputs that are put in generate the outputs that they do. This is just a technological feature of certain complex machine learning systems. Now, the standard, a lot of people don't like opaque algorithms. The standard defense of why the interpretability thesis is true, we call the transparency defense. And what it tries to explain is, in virtue of duties we have to decision subjects to provide them with a certain kind of information, that's what explains what's problematic about these systems. And as part of carrying out the transparency defense, you have to do a couple things. You have to explain where these duties of transparency come from. Why is that I owe you information of a certain kind? And then you have to be able to explain why opaque algorithms interfere with that duty. So you have to defend duties of transparency, you have to defend interference. But you immediately run into problems. A problem that applies to anybody trying to defend the interpretability thesis is what we call the definition problem, which is what exactly do you mean by explainability or interpretability? We think we can provide a general answer to that. The details of what exactly interpretability is will vary depending on how you answer questions further down the line. But we actually draw on some work from one of my colleagues, Katie Creel, to answer this first question: what is interpretability in the first place? But critics have made a big deal of this, so we think it's important to answer it. But people who defend the transparency defense have run into a bunch of criticism. One is that actually, it's hard to explain why you owe this sort of duty to give information of a certain form to your decision subjects when you use these systems. And the second problem is what we call the double standards problem. As soon as you start defending those certain cases, certain grounds for a transparency requirement, you start asking, well, but humans fail to meet that too. And so why are we holding algorithms to a higher standard than we hold human decision makers to? So that's sort of the landscape. And what we want to do is offer an alternative account of why the interpretability thesis is true, that we ground in what we call duties of due consideration, or the due consideration defense, which sort of takes a different perspective. It's of course about what we owe to decision subjects, but not in terms of information. But when we reason about someone from the moral perspective, we owe them certain things. There's certain evidence that I should disregard about you in certain contexts. There's certain facts I should take into account. There's certain specific features of a particular individual that an algorithmic system might be unable to take into account, but that I should. And we also say there's these other kinds of duties, duties of practical consideration would have to do with like exercising your capacity for empathy. We think that's the kind of thing. And so what we try to do in the project is defend these duties to show that they really exist. There's two different kinds, some about fact finding, like when I'm thinking about what I should think about you, the facts of the case, I'm constrained in certain ways. And others, just like when I exercise or when I think about what the moral constraints are on me for my decision making, that's a different set of duties. And then we try to argue that we can explain why these duties interfere with using opaque algorithms in a huge number of contexts, and why we don't end up holding humans to a double standard, although it's a little more nuanced, because sometimes we do think humans should be held to the same standard, and that's a reason for improving the human system just like the algorithmic system. But because human systems are very different than algorithmic systems, sometimes human systems are interferable with in ways that algorithmic systems are, so it's okay to have entirely different standards for either of them. I think that's my last slide, but I'll say this. I regularly teach tech and human values, moral philosophy, and an upper level seminar called AI ethics. I also, how much time do I have left on? A minute and a half, so much time. I talk so fast. I lead in quotes a bunch of projects around Northeastern having to do with AI and data ethics, and often am looking for student research collaborators. We have a big project on collecting a bunch of data from people that browse the web and then doing computational social science on it. I'm helping to build some of the ethics infrastructure for that. And we may be getting funding for this massive project on how to build trustworthy AI systems, which has massive ethical components. So there's some possibility in the future I'll be looking to take on research assistance. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, reach out to me. Thanks.
That's me, Vance, or my name anyway. So I have a joint appointment in philosophy and CS. I teach a course on technology and human values. In the spring, I'm also going to be teaching a section of debating ethical controversies. And I've applied to teach an intersection course on philosophy of friendship for 4 days next January. So I think I'll find out tomorrow whether that course is going to run. But today I'm going to talk about a paper that I'm working on social robots and parasocial relationships. So I have the slides out of order slightly, so let me skip ahead to the main claim. I want to argue about a particular way that we should think about relations to robots. And I want to make clear I'm talking about robots as they currently exist, so not as they currently exist and are likely to exist in the near future. So not the robots that we know and love and fear from science fiction. And that the best way for us to think about and interact with them is on the model of parasocial relationships. So let me talk about what that means. This is a term that was coined in the 50s to describe what was then a fairly recently widespread technology of television and the ways in which audiences came to feel that they knew the actors and the characters in TV shows as intimates, even though it was strictly a one-way relationship, right? So television characters, and certainly the actors who are portraying those people, very rarely are aware that you exist. They don't have a relationship to you. But because they were coming into your home in this way, once a week or more often, you felt as though you were getting to know them in particular ways. So there are other kinds of parasocial relationships that are illustrated there on the slide. So one on the lower left is the children who have imaginary friends, right? That's a kind of parasocial relationship. Internet influencers, as represented on the top there, also are a form of parasocial relation, where again, there's an audience and there's a performer, and the audience feels that they know that performer, even though the performer, again, probably isn't aware of the existence or individual personalities or anything else about the members of the audience. And then two, at least in an American context, very famous people, Tom Hanks and Barack Obama. Again, these are people whom many of us feel we know very well because they're very prominent in media and elsewhere, but we don't really know those people, right? And they certainly don't know us. So one of the things that characterizes parasocial relationships is that they're not reciprocal. So there is, in some sense, a debate about why we call them relationships in the first place, but it's an as-if sort of relationship. And that's the way that I think is helpful for us to think about social robots. So a social robot is a type of robot that's designed for a specific kind of interaction with us for a variety of contexts and purposes. But in general, the idea is that we're not talking about the kind of robots that weld car doors all day long or do other sorts of industrial tasks, but ones that are meant to exist in a sort of interactive relation with humans. So the one in the two that are represented in the upper left are Paro. These are robots that are designed to look like baby seals, and they have fur or the equivalent of fur. So these are often used with patients, people who have dementia, different forms of dementia, and who find it very comforting to have something that's like a pet, but that doesn't risk allergies or biting or having to be cleaned up after or to be fed. The one on the bottom is a robot called Casper. Casper has a very limited facial repertoire, and so it is used in interactions with especially children who have very severe forms of autism. So one of the characteristics of autism often is that you have a very low theory of mind, right? So it could be very difficult for you to recognize the meaning of other people's facial expressions. So Casper is a robot that is used to help train children to get better at being able to recognize facial expressions. And because the repertoire is so limited, it's less threatening. And there's less ambiguity about what different facial expressions mean. So let me talk briefly about why I think this sort of model makes sense. So the main thing that I think is important is to avoid deception. So again, considering that I'm talking about robots as they currently exist and their current features, I think that they lack any sort of interiority. They lack the capacity to like you back or to know anything about you. And so I think it's important when we're designing those things and programming them not to deceive people. One of the main reasons for that is that they have very almost unimaginable powers to collect information, right? In particular, if we're talking about social robots that may exist in someone's home, we're talking about the possibility of collecting a lot of data about a person's habits, and other aspects of their lives. And these are typically going to be owned by private companies. And so there's a question about where the data is going. So as I say here in the end, my actual policy recommendation or design recommendation is specifically for roboticists, that they should design robots in ways that break the fourth wall. So for example, they should preface responses that they give by starting with the phrase something like, I'm only a device, I don't have actual feelings, right? So in some cases, when you ask Siri a question, it gives a version of that sort of answer. So I'm advocating that more robots should be designed in that way, just to constantly remind us that they don't actually have the capacity to form relationships with us. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions? All right, I am Professor Sandler. I do research and teach in moral philosophy, environmental ethics, and ethics in emerging technologies. Today, I'm going to talk about work that's going on in ethics and philosophy of conservation. So here is a simplified and idealized representation of what might be called the standard conservation paradigm that has been dominant has framed basically conservation activities, particularly in North America, but has been exported all over the world. The basic idea is that our goal is to limit and remediate degradative anthropogenic impacts. We want to not degrade spaces. And then when we want to repair them, right? We want to restore them back, okay? And there's a standard repertoire for trying to do that. Creating parks and reserves, which is underneath the little box there. Native species prioritization, ecological restoration, captive breeding reintroduction programs. So the idea is you're trying to accomplish that goal. Conservationists and ecologists are trying to accomplish that goal through those means. And this goal isn't just like randomly selected. The idea is that the goal is justified because it helps to protect and promote a whole range of values and things that people care about. Okay, so that's the basic model. The model's been, okay, so what are the ethical issues about this model? Well, one is the export of this model into other contexts has been controversial in the way in which it intersects with other values globally. And then there's just like lots of issues with the particular things, like what sorts of values things have when you're doing restoration, what are the historical baseline you should be aiming for? How do you define ecological integrity? How do you trade off these different values when they come into conflict? Like there's all of this, like conservation philosophy has like been focused on trying to sort out how you implement this paradigm in different contexts and then deal with issues that arise in that implementation for like 40 years, 50 years, right? This is the story, okay. Here's the problem. The paradigm is completely falling apart, right? It's not just one issue or another issue, it's falling apart for two reasons. One reason, mass extinction, right? The background historical rate of extinction is about 1 species per million per year. There's about 10 to 15 million eukaryotic plant and animal species in the world. So the normal baseline rate of extinction would be about 10 to 15 species a year. Already 1,000 or as many as tens of thousands of species are going extinct a year, right? And it's going to get much worse because of climate change. So how does this model doesn't work very well in the context of that scale of extinction problems. Those strategies at the end are focused on smaller numbers of species at a time. That's one thing. And the other thing is that climate change. So the distinctive feature of climate change is really high rate and high scale ecological and climatic change that's caused by accumulation of global factors. But if you look at the model, the way in which the interventions work to accomplish the goal is by local interventions, creating a park and reserve in a place or a captive breeding and reintroduction program that's local, that's a local intervention. But if, for example, populations of polar bears are at risk of extinction because sea ice is declining, and the cause of that is increases in the global mean surface temperature due to the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, then you can't protect polar bears by creating a park or reserve or preventing people from hunting polar bears, because what's driving the loss is the global processes, okay? So the problem is that this model, so two problems. One is those means are less effective for accomplishing the goal of conservation. And the other thing is that the model doesn't seem that attuned to the ecological conditions that we are now in and that we're entering. Okay, so bad times for the environment, great times for environmental philosophy, right? Because there's a lot of really interesting questions here. Just let's be on the upside. Yeah. Okay, so one thing that conservation biologists are doing, they're like, whoa, we can't conserve species with the standard strategies. Here's one thing we need new strategies. So we need to, like, instead of trying to conserve species where they are, let's move them somewhere else. That's assisted migration or assisted colonization, managed relocation. Or maybe we should just rewild things in all kinds of different places, like we'll ecosystem engineer stuff. I have 1 minute? Okay, or another thing is maybe we need to use biotechnology to help this. So gene drives, cloning, all these sorts of things. But here's the problem there. Normally, the way in which you'd evaluate these different strategies is using a paradigm that's no longer applicable, right? So one aspect of the work that I'm doing is trying to figure out how do we evaluate these novel conservation strategies, particular biotechnologies is what I focus on, given that the background conservation is coming apart. And that's what I've been doing for several years. And I have some work on that. And if you're interested, let me know. Okay, but there's a deeper problem. There's a question. The deeper problem is that it's not just that the model is falling apart, It's that the very concepts that are the basis for the standard paradigm are no longer empirically adequate or are no longer track values in the ways that we think are important. Integrity and stability, what does that mean under conditions of climate change? Extinction, what does that mean when you can biobank materials and clone species a decade from now? What does it mean? Native species or non-native species prioritization doesn't make sense because it doesn't track ecological relationships anymore. So the very concepts that we use in conservation are no longer working very well. So here's the question: what concepts or categories should we use going forward in conservation philosophy? We need a whole new base, a whole new system, and this is an issue in philosophy that's connected to something called conceptual engineering or concept engineering, which is how do you go about the process? There's some methodological issues here. How do you go about creating new concepts for new kinds of social and epistemological and other normative goals? And I'll stop there because I'm way over time. There. All right. Thank you.
Is there any questions? I'm getting used to this. Like we do all this, we do the presentations, and there's no questions, but everybody talks to everybody else after the fact. So a question, good. Okay, are you still there, Judith?
Yes, I am still here.
Okay, we have a question for you.
Okay.
And hold on, I'm gonna get back. Gotta get the microphone started.
Oh my goodness. Okay. My question is, what are some examples of non-binary religious figures and what kind of influence do they have?
Excellent question. We have, for example, the most salient example in the research is the example of Native American Two-Spirit. I can't see anybody there, so I can't tell if I'm connecting or not. But
we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So basically, the Two-Spirit concept within Native American society. And first of all, we must establish the fact that there is no Native American society. There are over 600 groups, legally recognized groups in the United States alone, not to mention Canada and Mexico. So, but many of these do have a category of non-binary sexual identity or gender identity, not sexual, but gender identity. And so in many Native American societies, that the labor is gendered. And so if a young child grows up in many of these societies with a preference and a strength in an area that is not normally under that gender, they have the opportunity of moving into, both in terms of the way they react to people and respond to people, but also in terms of what they do in the culture, the roles they assume. They have the opportunity of moving into either a two-spirit, which means that you have both spirits inside you, male and female, or what we would now call changing into another gender. Now, this is a different phenomenon in each group. It has a different name according to their language, and each one of those functions in a slightly different way. So it's important not to obscure that. But this is something that the early settlers, when they saw it, they confused it not with a gender identity, with a sexual identity. And it's a completely different thing in this. It's not an issue of sexual identity. That's a completely separate question. It's an issue of gender identity, and they function throughout their lives as a person who lives in that gendered space. So that's one of the examples. Questions?
Thank you. Thank you. The other question.
Oh, what a thought. Okay, and those positions are often considered to be particularly blessed by the spirits. So it has, just to be that person, has a certain amount of religious authority. And that's an important concept also. Not only is there a space for that, but there is also religious authority given simply by virtue of being that, which we consider to be an exceptionally blessed existence.
Yeah, we're moving. Yeah, thank you very much. We got another question for I don't know who yet.
Okay.
Oh, for Professor Ricks.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Ask man.
Is there a proposed solution for a lot of robots is to break the fourth wall? Yeah. But a lot of these robots will be less effective if they break the fourth wall. I want a robotic community that and I don't want to be reminded that I'm talking about a robot. I want my autistic child to relate to normal people. And I don't want thing reminding the child that they're not real. Like I have like a robotic girlfriend or sex doll or whatever. Because like, I don't want to be reminded that like it's not the real thing. So like your solution would go against like the whole purpose of
Ben doesn't need it. So.
Right, Ben doesn't need it. Okay, so right, part of what I'm working at in the paper is an account of what we think some of the goods are of parasocial relationships, distinct from practice for real friendship, right? So is there a way that we could think about what you might get out of the kind of relationship that you're describing, other than just thinking about it as preparing you to have an actual reciprocal relationship with a human? So I'm still working through that. I do think there may be contexts like working with autistic children or with demented people where it may make sense to encourage them to see some sort of reciprocity or to treat the robot in that more reciprocal way. But I think for the rest of us, it's more like having an imaginary friend. And I think there may still be rich benefits psychologically that you can get from having an imaginary friend. Yeah. I don't know what to say. I'm still thinking of it. I'm still thinking through. So yeah.
Other questions? This is good. This is fun. Going once, going twice. All right, so we got pastries and coffee and stuff to drink and talk to people and peace. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. I think that was great.
You kept saying it was your favorite event, and I'm like, oh, there's all this pressure.
Oh no! It was still my favorite event. Oh.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you so much, Judith. Thanks to everyone who joined on Zoom. We will be posting the recording on our YouTube channel, so please keep an eye out for that.
Will do.
Awesome. Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.